You arrived at this video at the exact moment your soul needed to hear this truth. The title, "A Soul That Doesn't Evolve Suffers in Silence, and No One Notices," is not just describing something happening somewhere else to someone else. This is the precise spiritual crisis you are living through right now. Rudolf Steiner discovered that when a soul becomes trapped in spiritual stagnation, it enters a state of profound inner suffering that remains completely invisible to the outer world, creating what he called the most dangerous form of spiritual isolation. You are experiencing this now because your soul is crying out for the evolutionary leap it desperately needs, yet the silence surrounding your struggle makes you feel utterly alone in your spiritual desert. This phenomenon that Steiner identified reveals one of the most critical spiritual truths of our time. Souls that fail to evolve don't simply remain static, they suffer intensely in a silence so complete that even those closest to them remain, oblivious to their inner torment. You know this suffering intimately because you felt the burning thirst of a soul wandering in the desert, searching desperately for the spiritual spring that could quench your deepest longings, yet finding yourself surrounded by people who cannot see your spiritual drought. Steiner understood that this silent suffering occurs when the soul becomes disconnected from its evolutionary purpose, trapped between the sensible world that no longer satisfies and the supersensible world it cannot yet access. The invisible nature of this suffering creates a particularly cruel form of spiritual isolation. While physical pain draws attention and sympathy, the agony of a stagnant soul remains hidden behind the facade of normal daily functioning. You continue to work, to interact, to fulfill your social roles, all while your inner being withers from spiritual malnutrition. Steiner recognized that modern consciousness, focused entirely on external phenomena, has lost the capacity to perceive the spiritual distress of others. This blindness to soul suffering represents one of the greatest tragedies of our materialistic age. Countless souls are dying spiritually while surrounded by people who notice nothing amiss. Your silent suffering stems from what Steiner identified as the soul's fundamental need for continuous spiritual evolution. When this evolution ceases, the soul doesn't simply pause, it begins to experience what he described as a form of spiritual death, while still inhabiting a living body. The soul knows its cosmic purpose, understands its need to grow and transform, yet finds itself trapped in patterns, relationships, and circumstances that prevent this essential development. Like a plant trying to grow in soil depleted of nutrients, your soul struggles against conditions that cannot support its spiritual flowering, creating an inner anguish that words cannot adequately express. The silence surrounding your suffering becomes even more profound when you realize that those around you may actually prefer your spiritual stagnation. Steiner observed that evolved souls often threaten the comfort zones of those still sleeping spiritually. Your growth would challenge others to examine their own spiritual poverty, so unconsciously, they may discourage or ignore your attempts at transformation. This creates a double isolation. Not only does your suffering go unnoticed, but your very attempts to evolve may be subtly sabotaged by those who claim to care about you. The soul that seeks to break free from spiritual stagnation often discovers that its greatest obstacles come not from external circumstances, but from the unconscious resistance of others who fear being left behind in their own spiritual sleep. Steiner's spiritual science reveals exactly why a soul that doesn't evolve suffers in silence, and why no one notices this profound spiritual crisis unfolding before their very eyes. Through his clairvoyant investigations, he discovered that the human soul exists simultaneously in multiple dimensions of reality, and when evolutionary development ceases in the supersensible realm, it creates what he termed spiritual asphyxiation, a condition where the soul literally begins to suffocate from lack of higher nourishment, yet this suffocation remains completely invisible to ordinary consciousness. You are experiencing this spiritual asphyxiation right now because your soul has outgrown its current spiritual container, desperately needing to expand into higher realms of consciousness, but finding itself trapped in circumstances that prevent this essential metamorphosis. The silence surrounding your soul's suffering occurs because modern humanity has lost what Steiner called soul perception, the natural ability to recognize the spiritual states of others. In ancient times, communities possessed this innate sensitivity to the soul life of their members, but the development of intellectual consciousness has created a spiritual blindness that makes us expert at reading external symptoms while remaining completely oblivious to internal spiritual crises. Your friends, family, and colleagues see your physical presence, hear your words, observe your actions, yet they cannot perceive the spiritual desert you're wandering through, the inner drought that leaves your soul parched and desperate for the living waters of higher consciousness. Steiner identified 3 specific stages of this silent soul suffering that you may recognize in your own experience. First comes what he called spiritual hunger, an indefinable longing that no material satisfaction can fill, a restless searching that drives you to seek something you cannot name. Then follows soul isolation, the growing realization that no one around you understands your inner world, creating a profound loneliness that exists even in crowded rooms. Finally arrives evolutionary despair, the crushing recognition that you're trapped in spiritual stagnation while your soul screams for transformation, growth, and the fulfillment of its cosmic purpose. Consider the case of Vincent van Gogh, whose letters reveal the exact phenomenon Steiner described: a soul suffering intensely from spiritual stagnation while surrounded by people who saw only his external struggles. Van Gogh's paintings were desperate attempts to express the supersensible realities his soul perceived, yet the world around him remained blind to his spiritual crisis, focusing instead on his material poverty and emotional instability. His soul was evolving rapidly through artistic inspiration, but when that evolution was blocked by external circumstances and lack of understanding, his silent suffering became unbearable. Similarly, Nikola Tesla experienced this same invisible spiritual crisis. His soul had evolved to perceive cosmic electrical forces, yet he lived in profound isolation because no one could understand the supersensible realities that tormented and inspired him simultaneously. The solution Steiner offers begins with understanding that your silent suffering is actually a spiritual birth process. Your soul is trying to give birth to its next evolutionary stage. But like any birth, this process involves intense labor pains that others cannot feel or understand. The very fact that you're suffering in this particular way indicates that your soul has reached a critical threshold where it can no longer tolerate spiritual stagnation. This suffering is not punishment. It's your soul's way of forcing you toward the evolutionary leap you desperately need but have been unconsciously resisting. If you're ready to transform this silent suffering into conscious spiritual evolution, subscribe to this channel now, because we're going to explore exactly how Steiner's methods can guide you through this crucial spiritual metamorphosis. Tell me in the comments, how has your soul's silent suffering been manifesting in your daily life? What signs have you noticed that others around you seem completely unable to see or understand? The awakening process that transforms a soul's silent suffering into conscious evolution begins with what Steiner called the recognition of spiritual emergency. The moment when you stop pretending that your inner drought is normal and acknowledge that your soul is literally dying from lack of evolutionary nourishment. You must understand that your silent suffering is not a character flaw or emotional weakness. It's your soul's emergency signal, desperately trying to alert you that spiritual stagnation has become a life-threatening condition. Steiner discovered that souls trapped in evolutionary paralysis develop what he termed spiritual anemia, a condition where the soul's connection to cosmic forces becomes so weakened that it can barely sustain its own existence, let alone fulfill its higher purpose. The first step in breaking this cycle of silent suffering involves developing what Steiner called inner honesty about soul needs, the courage to admit that your current life circumstances, relationships, and activities are spiritually malnourishing. Your soul. You've been trying to convince yourself that you should be grateful for what you have, that your restlessness is selfish, that your longing for something higher is unrealistic. But Steiner revealed that this kind of spiritual self-denial is actually a form of soul murder. You're slowly killing your own evolutionary potential by refusing to acknowledge its legitimate needs. Your soul doesn't evolve through gratitude for spiritual poverty. It evolves through courageously pursuing the higher consciousness it's destined to achieve. The silence surrounding your suffering begins to break when you start practicing what Steiner called soul observation, the daily discipline of witnessing your inner states with the same attention you would give to physical symptoms. Every morning, before engaging with the external world, you must ask yourself, what is my soul trying to tell me today? What evolutionary step is it demanding that I take? This practice gradually develops your capacity to hear your soul's voice above the noise of social expectations and material obligations. Steiner emphasized that souls communicate through what he called evolutionary urgency, a persistent inner pressure that grows stronger the longer you ignore it. Consider the transformation of Carl Jung, who experienced exactly this type of silent soul suffering during what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. For years, Jung's soul had been evolving beyond the limitations of Freudian psychology, but he remained trapped in professional obligations and social expectations that prevented him from expressing his deeper spiritual insights. His soul suffered in complete silence. His colleagues saw only his professional success while remaining blind to his inner spiritual crisis. The breakthrough came when Jung finally honored his soul's evolutionary demands, allowing himself to explore the supersensible realms that his rational mind had been rejecting. His Red Book documents this exact process of transforming silent suffering into conscious spiritual evolution. The most crucial insight Steiner offers is that your soul's silent suffering contains within it the exact blueprint for your next evolutionary stage. The specific nature of your inner drought reveals precisely what kind of spiritual nourishment your soul requires. If you're suffering from creative stagnation, your soul is demanding artistic expression as a pathway to higher consciousness. If you're experiencing relationship isolation, your soul is calling you toward deeper spiritual community. If you feel trapped in meaningless work, your soul is insisting that you discover and fulfill your cosmic mission. The suffering itself is the map. You just need to learn how to read it. Steiner taught that the moment you begin consciously cooperating with your soul's evolutionary demands, the universe responds by providing exactly the opportunities, people, and circumstances you need for your spiritual development. But this cooperation requires what he called evolutionary courage, the willingness to disappoint others, to break free from limiting circumstances, to choose your soul's growth over social approval. Your silent suffering will continue until you develop this courage, because evolution cannot be forced from outside. It must be chosen from within. The transformation from silent suffering to conscious evolution creates what Steiner called spiritual magnetism, an invisible force that begins attracting people, opportunities, and circumstances aligned with your soul's higher purpose. Those who couldn't see your suffering will suddenly notice something different about you, though they won't be able to identify exactly what has changed. You'll discover that your willingness to evolve consciously gives others permission to examine their own spiritual stagnation, creating ripple effects that extend far beyond your individual transformation. The very souls who once ignored your silent crisis may now seek your guidance, as they begin experiencing their own evolutionary urgency. Consider how Rumi's transformation illustrates this exact process. His soul suffered in silence for years. As a conventional religious scholar, until his meeting with Shams of Tabriz catalyzed his evolutionary breakthrough. The same people who had known him as a quiet, unremarkable teacher suddenly witnessed the emergence of one of history's greatest mystical poets. His silent suffering had been preparing him for a level of spiritual expression that revolutionized not only his own consciousness, but the spiritual understanding of countless others. Similarly, Eckhart Tolle's years of silent depression and spiritual crisis prepared him for the sudden awakening that transformed him into a guide for millions, seeking their own evolutionary breakthrough. The final integration requires understanding that your journey from silent suffering to conscious evolution is not complete until you become what Steiner called a bridge for other souls, someone who can recognize the invisible spiritual crises of others and offer the understanding that you desperately needed during your own dark night of the soul. Your experience of being unnoticed in your suffering gives you the sensitivity to perceive when others are trapped yet in their own evolutionary stagnation. You become living proof that souls can break free from spiritual death and emerge into higher consciousness, offering hope to those who are currently wandering in their own spiritual deserts. This channel exists to support exactly this kind of spiritual awakening, helping souls transform their silent suffering into conscious evolution and discover their cosmic purpose. Your journey from stagnation to growth is not just personal healing. It's a contribution to the spiritual evolution of humanity itself. Share in the comments how you plan to honor your soul's evolutionary demands and break free from the silence that has been suffocating your spiritual